Hello, everyone. Welcome to 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Glad to have you with us. If you get a second and you can rate the podcast, review the podcast on your various services, that helps to get this in front of other people, makes it easier to find. I remember in the early days, there were times I would, search the podcast and just hardly couldn't find it. So all you're looking it up, rating, reviewing, following, subscribing, wherever you're at, that really helps to get this podcast out in front of other people. And we're so thankful for all of you that are with us and continue to do that. If you haven't subscribed, just take a second while I'm yakking about all this stuff to subscribe if you aren't. Subscribe to the Mended Collective on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as following the podcast on Facebook and Instagram as well. And like I say, as subscribing with your favorite podcast hosts and giving some ratings. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 33 through 34 will be our text for today. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone's hungry, have meat at home, so that you do not come together for judgment. As to the remaining matters, I will give instructions when I come. This text finishes our section on the Lord's Supper, a.k.a. communion, a.k.a. the Lord's table, a.k.a. the body and blood, a.k.a. the body and the bread and cup of the Lord. This is a text I've heard all my life, but I want to say that the dive into it has been deeply rewarding and instructive and convicting to me. I mean, I've heard this text read at least once a month, probably every year I've ever been alive. And yet there's still things to learn here. And it's such a blessing. And not just as a theological apparatus to answer questions, but really instructive for me to just do better when I come around the table of the Lord personally. And I want to encourage you to that. It's a great blessing to do that. So there's the plug there. Paul started with a rebuke. The Corinthians had drunkenness, disunity, despising the poor, and the general issue of turning the Lord's Supper into a common meal, with their gatherings more generally taking on the temper of a social gathering and like the worst parts of social gatherings, with all the jockeying for position and acclaim. Paul presents that the feast Christ personally delivered to him is nothing of this sort. Instead of self-preservation and self-exaltation, is about self-emptying and self-denial, as Christ dined with his betrayer Judas and all his disciples who would soon forsake him. He offered this feast of himself in his body and his blood to the very men who would turn their back on him or stab him in the back within a few hours. This calls us to remember him, and it calls us to declare our faith and reliance on his death till he comes. These moments of reflections upon the death of Christ are declarative, but they should also be transformative. We think upon Christ's sacrifice, and we examine ourselves in light of that. And that may be our forgiven state and rejoice towards God for it. That might be our besetting sin, and we implore his grace to endure and overcome. That may be a recent acute sin, and we plead his forgiveness and continual repentance from that. Our minds kind of are moving between two poles here. It's Christ's work and our personal conduct. His work centered around his work on the cross and what we're doing, and these two things back and forth, understanding them in light of each other, sort of like analyzing, two sides of a coin, looking at one. How does this thing help me understand this thing? How does it help me understand this thing? When we do this, it gives spiritual life, and a failure to enter this type of examination quickly leads us to spiritual weakness and stupor. By undergoing this self-discernment and transformation, we avoid the wrath of God against sin, because we've already judged it to be unacceptable, and we've judged it in our lives, and we've brought it under the reign of Christ. And so whenever Christ returns, he won't bring that under subjection to his feet, because we've already done that. But we move it out of our lives in light of Christ's sacrifice. Today we have a shorter text, but it certainly serves as a summary of many of the things that we've discussed in our big idea, which is partake for good. Partake for good. Our supporting ideas are, number one, wait for each other. Number two, this is a spiritual meal. And number three, misplaced purpose breeds disobedience. Wait for each other. This is a spiritual meal. And misplaced purpose breeds disobedience. Wait, spiritual, and purpose are those words that will guide our thoughts today. As we mentioned, Paul has just outlined the importance of this practice, this meaningful practice in following God's intention. In doing so, we don't fall into spiritual sickness or death. And as verse 33 says, Paul then moves to, so then. That is, the truths about the abuses of the Lord's table, the proper order, and the reasons behind them should move them to certain modifications and repentance in their practice and in their administration of this particular feast, this ritual, this ceremony. Notice Paul addresses them here. This is an interesting thing. He says, so then my brothers and sisters. He doesn't just say so then brothers or so then brothers and sisters. Obviously the word brothers there is a masculine noun, but it means just people. Brothers and sisters is appropriate there. But he qualifies that as mine. He relates and connects themselves to it. And he wants them to see him connected to them and to consider himself as part of them. And I think this is quite intentional because he wants to ground this ceremony in the unity that it requires, because it's essential to do that. He wants to ground it in the unity that it requires and that it creates. And this is basically his admonition. When you come together, obviously a statement of unity because it's with other people that you come together, wait for one another. And so Paul's desire of the unity this requires and creates is shown in that admonition. This has been alluded to in verse 21, where it says one takes their supper ahead of others. And this practice speaks more broadly to a preference of the rich over the poor, also mentioned there in verse 21. And my historical understanding is that the church would gather, and when everyone arrived, they would take communion. And those who were delayed were those who had to work. They were enslaved or just generally poor. As such, this refusal to wait for each other and going ahead is a method of cutting the poor folks out, and I guess suppose could be used to cut just people out in general, like, oh, you missed it? Well, we got to take it, sort of thing. Paul is saying that this practice of starting earlier to cut other people out is antithetical to the purpose of acknowledging our mutual need for Christ's sacrifice. It does the exact opposite of that. Now, I do want to quickly say this passage of wait for one another or tarry ye one for another, a lot of King James in my head on this passage for whatever reason. But this passage is sometimes you say, if someone's running late, you got to hold up services and hold up communion for them. And I'm not going to argue where that may have a place, but contextually the situation here is pretty different than our modern society because we've got clocks and people's ability to be on time. And I unless there's emergencies, and in which case if there's emergencies, I think that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath sort of situation that Christ understands. We need to have a practice of normatively being here. But there's also emergencies that happen. And so in that case, it doesn't really need to wait. But I think the better general principle to draw out of this, what he really means there is don't intentionally do things that give people no chance of being there. Don't set things up where people cannot participate, whatever that is. I mean, and that may be, like service time. I mean, if I put that thing at 4 a.m., it's going to be pretty tough for anybody to be there, Whereas, in our town, it may be that there's shift work going on. We don't have shift work. And so it might be appropriate for us as a body to have services at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, maybe in the morning, I don't know. Whenever it is, to make sure that can happen and people have that chance. But we shouldn't intentionally do things to where people cannot get there. And we certainly need to make sure that we're not planning or aligning our services in the way where we're cutting people out. That's so against the purpose here, which is what they were doing, right? That's the thing that's being rebuked, is setting things up where people are cut out. Don't do that. It's not necessarily about emergencies or people's tardiness when they could be on time. Next, Paul says that if anyone is hungry, they should eat at home. Now, I'll quickly say the current historical data indicates that the church largely met in homes of likely wealthier members. Further, there's New Testament data to this effect with references in Romans, later in 1 Corinthians, Colossians, and Philemon. While there's some speculation about the particulars of this arrangement, it is clear that that wasn't an unusual thing to happen. So all that to say is Paul's saying, if you're hungry, eat at home. But it's possible that they're already in a home. And it's possible that they're in the home of a rich member who's causing this problem. So what are we to make of this? It's like, okay, well, the person causing the problem needs to just eat at home. Oh, wait, they're already at home. They can just keep causing the problem? That's not what Paul's doing. I think the simplest answer is that Paul's isn't so much defining location as setting. That is, different actions are appropriate in different places and situations. There's a distinction between allowable behavior, quote, when you come together, what we might call during church or in worship, and then there's allowable behavior at home. And in that case, at home isn't so much about the location as much as it is to when you're not at church or outside of services or not in the public setting. Else, I think this at home doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Now, There are some who say that the difference between worship services and everyday life is synthetic. It's not real. It's made up. It's fabricated. But I think this text is pretty well a slam dunk to say that there's two different settings and there's two different sets of rules. In one case, it's appropriate to eat, and in one case, it's not appropriate to eat, even if we might give them different names. And last, I want to note that this shows that the purpose of the meal is not the purpose of a traditional meal. When we use the word feast, supper, or meal to refer to the Lord's Supper, we're using it in a bit of a metaphorical sense. Unlike a usual meal, the point of communion is not to satisfy my physical hunger, it's to turn my heart toward Christ and to focus on Him. So I will say this text leads to some debates about, bringing food in church or having a snack during church or, eating in the building and things like that. And I think those are really outside the context of what's going on here. I do think that we should be mindful, especially if you take the body and blood of the Lord and you're chasing the grape juice with coffee, okay, hold on a second. You might want to think about that. Or you're, eating a bite of what you call an Uncrustable after the body before the grape juice gets there. I think there is something to be said for the sanctity of that, and also just a general principle of do the things at home. That's a pretty good principle here. Do the things at home, and I don't think this speaks to church facilities and all that stuff. That's another discussion. But okay, last thing. Paul says that this needs to happen so that they don't come together for judgment. This final warning shows the importance and imperativeness of these instructions. These aren't suggestions. These aren't things they might add to their life given the opportunity if they get around to it. Rather, as we've discussed, the way they're partaking of this was making it to where they were coming together for the worse and not for the better. They were getting further away from Christ by the practice they were doing. And part of the reason the judgment of God was upon them was because of the sins that we've mentioned, but especially of the division and despising the poor. When we get our eyes off of our spiritual purpose, off of what we're doing, we find carnal aims to pursue, which will eventually come out in what we're really doing. So they're bringing judgment on themselves because they're manifesting the works of the flesh. They're doing fleshly things. They're doing things that are literally sins in the middle of this, and so that brings judgment on them. Further, they're bringing judgment on them in the fact that they're making a mockery of the body and blood of Christ, counting it an unholy thing, and that quite literally drinks and eats judgment on themselves and being guilty of the body and blood of Christ because they treat it as a contemptuous thing. What should cover them as a means of salvation ends up speaking against them as it displays their general lack of reverence for the sacrifice of the Son of God. Further, the fact that they don't examine their sinfulness means that they're not disciplined by the Lord and then encouraged to do better. The fact that they don't or refuse to recognize their sin through an examination portends the future judgment of God, because it may well be that they unrepentantly continue in a sin, which God says that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So there's kind of those three areas in which they may be coming under judgment, and Paul, as their brother, my brothers and sisters, wants to save them from that judgment. As we wrap up, I want to consider this final phrase. Paul says, "I'll give instructions about the rest when I come." Now, it's hard to say exactly what he was referring to. I tend to think that Sister Ethel had likely started using shortening in the communion bread instead of butter. And Paul is assuring them that he'll take care of that, but they need to be patient. Obviously, I'm kidding. That's probably not what was going on. We can't really say. But here's why I want to bring this up, is not to make some weird thing about Sister Ethel, who I'm sure is very nice. But I do want to note the fact that there are some things that can wait. Paul's saying, There's stuff here. There's stuff that's not quite right that needs addressing, but it can hold on. But what that does is it shows the urgency of these things. By saying the rest of the stuff, it can wait, means this stuff can't wait. It needs to be addressed now. And notice, in large part, this is about the logistics of how this is done. There's heart problems, but there's things about how this needs to happen. How do we do communion? How do we execute it? We might say, what's the big deal on the logistical execution of this practice? It doesn't matter how we do it. We just need to do it. The details, they don't really matter. And this is where you get churches having, Coca-Cola and hamburgers for communion and all other sorts of things about, well, it doesn't matter what we do. We don't have to really do it necessarily the way they did it, but we just got to, do something, and the particulars are unimportant. And apparently the details about not turning this into a common meal were crucial to their souls because it caused them to eat and drink judgment on themselves. And fortunately or unfortunately for us, we don't have the Apostle Paul to tell us which are the important details and which are the ones that can be ignored. And so we need to make sure that even in these technical, logistical things, that we pursue God with a full heart, to the best of our abilities. And we can't just say, well, it probably doesn't matter, so I'm just going to ignore that. That's unwise, and that's foolish. And instead, we need to make sure that we're conforming our actions and our practices within our church context to the will of God in all things. Do you have a genuine care for others in communion? In church in general, when you come there, is there an emphasis on the togetherness and the needs of others? You looking at that, you watching them, how you can help them? Or do you adopt this like silo mentality where it's just you and God in this chamber and everybody else is kind of there, but they're incidental to what's going on? Do you keep in mind the spiritual intentions in communion, or are you more focused on whether it has butter or shortening in it, or whatever other carnal distraction can go on? Does the way you approach the Lord's Supper lead you closer to the wrath of God or to the salvation of Christ at his return? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: partake for good.